Okay, if y'all have trouble hearing me, then move up. Like that will happen, right? Okay, I guess it's time to begin. Ross, did you give me a thumbs up? Or okay, very good. Welcome to our Sunday morning Bible class. Those of you that are joining us on the internet, we welcome you also to our class. We had a good time last night at the Meeks and their farm, and it was fun. Beautiful place. So if you were not able to go, we missed you. We had a good time around the campfire and sang and roasted marshmallows. It was really cool. So I want to thank the Meeks for inviting us to do that. The Gospel of Mark is what we're talking about this morning, and I didn't get to finish the outline, but I just want to summarize the closing part of last week's outline. If you look at Mark chapter 1, beginning in verse 21 of Mark 1, we've noticed some things about the Gospel of Mark. It's a gospel of action. One of the reasons we know that is it has so many things that have to do with Jesus performing certain deeds and actions. And chapter 1 is a long chapter of his activities. And we notice the word, the adverb, immediately being used constantly in the Gospel of Mark around these activities of Jesus, which again emphasizes the activity and the swiftness of Jesus' movement in his ministry. And the interesting thing about it is one of the perspectives in regard to the movement of Mark and the swiftness of it is that Mark's interest is to get you to the cross as quick as possible. And so there's a lot of things that are omitted by Mark that the other Gospels have, but Mark has a strategic goal in redefining what Messiah is. And this comes out in chapter 1 and also the other places in which Jesus exorcises demons out of people. If you'll notice, beginning in verse 21, they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and began to teach. They were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And Jesus rebuked him and said, "Be quiet and come out of him." The underlying original is pretty emphatic. It's like, shut up and get out. So in regard to this, I got a question for you. Why is it that Jesus always silenced the truth that the demons said concerning him? Because he is the Holy One of Israel. He is the Son of God. He does have the power to destroy them. Why, in Mark particularly, we see this over and over, why is there a suppression of this true statement and affirmation of who the identity of Jesus is? Okay. We got something going on that nobody else knows about. Yeah. They have some inside knowledge, and I'm confirming that. He could do that. Yeah. Someone that says like having someone from the mafia as a witness to your character, it just wouldn't work right. But truth is truth, no matter out of whose mouth it comes from. I remember when Paul was talking about those who preach the gospel for selfish means and all that, and then those who were honest. And he said, as long as what? The gospel is preached. I'll make it a stretch here, but I just, it's kind of interesting. Charlie, you want to say something? Okay, Ibid, for you. Okay. Okay. So, on one instance, he would tell people when they were healed not to say anything because it may hinder his ministry, because he might all of a sudden, which he did anyway, get a crowd around him and begin to minister. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Potentially, yeah. Okay. Yeah, and the Son of Man comes, and you say he's a gluttonous. Yeah, yeah. So no matter where he was, they would try to entrap him. But don't you? It's kind of interesting, isn't it? I think that's always something that's raised as a question when the Bible is read or in the Bible class. Someone says, "Well, why the suppression of the?" It's not a real confession, but it's a mark of reality. They know who Jesus is. It's kind of like what James says. The demons know who God is, and they even shudder, but they don't obey. That's the difference between being lost and one being saved. There may be another reason in Mark, and I say this in regard to the structure of it and the purpose that Mark has in getting to his purpose very quickly in his book. Somebody else had something? I heard a voice. I don't want you to be suppressed or anything.
One thing I want to add too is the fact that in connection with all this, we're told not to have any fellowship with unfruitful works of darkness.
Uh-huh.
Well, Jesus didn't seem to have fellowship at all with the demonic world.
So yours is totally from the perspective of perception of what others might say that he's in cahoots.
On the one hand, he's telling us not to have fellowship. On the other hand, he's accepted their testimony and not doing anything to make it seem like he has nothing to do with them. Yet he's telling us not to have anything.
Well, if the demon comes and confesses him, and Jesus exorcises the demon, does that do anything to the confession that the demon had? I mean, does that diminish it? Does that put Jesus in cahoots with him?
It has this ability, in my estimation at least, to seem like he's trying to have it both ways. The perception would be that way. Because, see, you're talking about more of a plane of a cosmic plane than it is with us. We're having to deal with human beings. Mm-hmm. Jesus is on another level. Mm-hmm. And if he accepts this testimony from the demonic world and it's true, this is something more than what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And getting to what he was just pointing out about John the Baptizer, there's a lot of accusations that are thrown against people, but they don't stick because there's no credibility. Mm-hmm. In this case, there'll be credibility to it because Jesus had accepted their testimony, and yet later on, he's saying, "Oh, I don't have anything to do with it." Here again, the woman that called under a sinful woman that came washing feet, drying her hair. Mm-hmm. He said, "You know what kind of woman this was, you wouldn't allow her to touch you like that." So, he said, "I had come to the well, but Simon didn't do nothing for me. Mm-hmm. They didn't give me no water, they didn't feed me." Right. And Jesus was associated with basically the unclean people. And so they took that once again as a fault of Jesus. And he said, "You know what?"
Right. So he was already, from your perspective, he was already guilty anyway, whether he accepted the claim of what is it?
There's no spiritual warfare going on that's perceived by the world. In this sense, Jesus was actually had come in contact with demonic spirits and demons, mm-hmm. and that we don't have any contact.
Yeah, there was a window of the demonic spirit and all that being open during Jesus' ministry to show his power over them.
And he could not have any kind of fellowship or perceived fellowship with them. That's something on a different level from what we're doing.
Right. Shut up. I like that better. Especially toward a demon, right? So, okay, those are all real good, sound, and logical answers, but are totally off base. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, I even got David riled up this morning, man. Well, I'm going to take it in a different direction. And I think what David and everybody's saying, I mean, there's truth to all of that. But I think there's a strategy on the part of Mark, and that may be more true in regard to even the other Gospels, but in the context of Mark, Mark's Gospel is getting to Jesus at the cross. He's redefining what the perception of Messiah is in the minds of the disciples. Of course, we already know, what did the disciples expect that the Messiah would come and be? Earthly kingdom, conqueror, powerful, all of these things. I mean, for the Messiah from the Roman perspective, what would Messiah be? I mean, you'd have to be more powerful than whom? The legion? Well, we have Mark 5, the legion there. You'd have to be more powerful than the emperor cult, all these kinds of things that are part of the Roman society, okay? So Jesus is demonstrating in chapter 1 his power over what? Demonic world, disease, sickness, all these kinds of things that he's able to do just in chapter 1 immediately. So, I mean, after chapter 1, it's kind of like what else can be done to show the authority and power of who Christ is. So, in one sense, he's confirming in the minds of the Romans, in the minds of disciples, the power of who he is, right? Look at all that he's done. Well, that just automatically, in a sense, affirms their thinking of it. Here comes the Messiah. And so they're expecting he has this ability. Why don't you use the ability now to free us from under the bondage of Rome? Why don't you use your ability then to, exercise somewhat of an angelic host and just lay waste those who tried to conquer us? Because everybody has acknowledged who you are. The demonic world, sickness, the laws of nature, death, all of these are witnesses to whom? His power, his authority. So when the demonic spirits come out in all these places and they herald him or say, honestly, they know who he is. They're scared to death of him in every instance. And they're thrown out. But they're constantly saying, you are the Christ, you're the Son of God. It seems to me that in Mark's strategy, his purpose, the reason that these things are shown in Mark and grouped together is, and for him to silence them, is Mark is taking the definition of what it means to be a disciple, the Messiah, okay, what it means to be a Messiah, and then ultimately a disciple, and he's redefining all of this. Don't listen to the spirits. Don't be putting your trust in my ability to heal the sick. Don't be elevating because I have the authority over these things that I'm somehow who you think I am. Because the disciples don't get it in Mark. They don't get it. And so when you go through Mark, and in that midsection that we'll eventually get to, there is a redefinition of what Messiah is. Jesus says 3 times, I must be delivered over. Well, if he has the power, why is he being delivered over? I'll be beaten. Well, if he has the power and everybody acknowledges who he is, why is he allowing others to beat him when he's innocent? And I'll be put to death. Well, if he has the power over death, why is he allowing others to put him to death? All of these things are what people would expect a Messiah who is going to be an earthly king to overcome and have the ability and the power, being of God, to rule over. And yet, in every instance, Even when they try to make him a king, when they try to do this because of what he shows himself to be, and all the affirmations of his true identity, Mark is strategically changing the definition of what a Messiah is. That's why when we get into the midsection that starts with the event where the man is healed in 2 stages, his sight. The first time Jesus, works on him, he says, "What do you see?" "I see trees as if they're walking." It's not real clear. And then the second time, he does his work, and it says, "Oh, I see all things clearly." And then we have the midsection. And the question is, who are the ones who see trees as if they're walking? I think Mark is strategically suggesting that's where we are at this stage, everyone. Or you're out of focus. And then you come to the second sight healing at the end of the midsection of Bartimaeus. And he cries, and he says, Jesus says, "What do you want?" He says, "I want to see." And Jesus heals him. And he sees clearly. And after that point, what happens? Go straight to the cross execution. Straight to it. I mean, this is whoa from Mark. So from Mark's perspective, just keep in mind as we go through it, I think all of the things that are said are valid, but I think Mark has a larger purpose in what he's doing by inspiration in presenting Jesus. He is challenging the notion of how people have defined in their expectations and in their head and what true power is. And he's using and he's addressing the Roman worldview in which power is what? Authority over, might, and military prowess, the emperor, the Roman society. And one of the touchstones is in Mark 5 when you have that demonic, those demonic spirits that are, housed in this man. And he says, "What's your name?" "Legion." And they're terrified. They come to him, don't send us over here. And Jesus says, "We'll go." So, to me, when I look at Mark and chart through it, there's a larger or a higher issue at stake. And it has to do with the conceptions of who the Messiah is and how one defines that. And so when you read about this in Mark chapter 1, now I want you to go over real quickly to Mark 8. To Mark 8. This is the only place in the Gospels, it's in Mark, where you have this strong statement to Peter. And Peter is like the blind man who sees trees walking around. He's not seeing things clearly. He thinks he is. He thinks he knows who the Messiah is to be and what his purpose is on earth. But in actuality, he's just as wrong as everybody else in their definition of Messiah. And so we have verse 27. Jesus went out along with the disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Everybody's familiar with the confession of Peter. And on the way, he questioned his disciples, saying, "Who do people say that I am?" Told him, "John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others says the prophet." And he continued to question them. "Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ." And he warned them to tell no one about him. Okay, we have Peter here that gives confession, and then Jesus warns him and them not to tell anything. And he began to teach. Teaching comes right after this confession. When Peter confesses him, "You are the Christ," what do you think he has in his mind concerning the Messiah? What's his conception of Messiah when he says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God"? Let's take it. Let's take him now. Is that what is in his mind? Well, it must have been something like that, because what we read next is very interesting. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Now, this idea of Messiah being killed was a weakness. You know, for any powerful leader to fall, as he indicates here, would not be very impressive to those who are looking for what? The most powerful, person of God to come upon the scene as people are expecting this Messiah. He's killed, and 3 days later he'll rise again. They never really caught that, and it's like a tagline. He'll rise again, but they they never kind of grasped that. And he was stating the matter plainly. No figures, no kind of abstract ideas. He explains the matter plainly. Peter takes offense of what his Messiah has said. So what's Peter's offense? Why is Peter taking him aside and began to do what? The audacity of Peter to rebuke Jesus for Jesus stating plainly that he was going to be rejected, he was going to be beaten, and buried, killed and then buried. 3 days later, he'll rise again. What's in the mind of Peter? Why is Peter rebuking him? No. Now, Jesus, you quit talking about death and rejection and being beaten, man. That's showing what? Showing what? Weakness. You don't need to be like that. It's not going to happen that way. You're the Son of God. You're the Son of God. Why in the world would you lead us down this path? Does that mean that we're going to fall with you? What does that say about us? Well, continue reading. But turning around and seeing his disciples, now this is real telling. He sees his disciples. He rebuked Peter and said, now, the underlying language indicates that he's talking to everyone. It's in the plural, though he's looking at Peter. It's kind of like a parent rebuking a child, but he wants the other one to hear what he's saying. He's speaking to everybody. He says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you, plural, for you are not setting your mind on what? God's interest, but man's." What does that implicate Peter of? What's the implication on the part of Peter? He's minding whose interests? Himself, ultimately, but man's. And minding his own interest and man's interest is putting him as an enemy on the opposite side of who? Christ. Get behind me, who? Satan. Satan. You Satans. What is Satan? Adversary. Antagonist. Against. Now, that's the harshest language that you can read besides Matthew 23 in regard to the hypocrites of the Pharisees, right? Would you agree with that? I mean, this is one of the harshest places. And it's said to whom? Peter, a disciple of the Lord. But it's really said to all of them. They're all thinking the same way Peter. He just had, the boldness and the audacity to actually take him aside. I'd like to picture how he took him aside. Come here. They went off in a little corner maybe and discussed. Jesus rejected it forthrightly, embarrassed it. humiliated him because he's on the wrong side. So what side does Peter need to be on? Christ's side. Well, if you're on Christ's side, what does that mean, according to Mark? According to Jesus. I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to be beaten. I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to be killed. 3 days later, I'll rise. It's always that tagline, 3 days later, I'll rise. They never caught that. The power of the resurrection. But see, it was weakness to the world in antiquity, to the Jews and to the Romans, to everybody else. How could it would be weakness today? How could anybody be strong if they laid themselves down, didn't exercise their power? Yes, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. The real power. And that's the real power is going to be when Jesus is on that cross and sheds his blood for the sins of everyone. And then by the power of God, he's raised from the dead. Go ahead. Yeah, Maccabees and all them.
The Greeks had come through, the Syrians, all this fighting, all this warring, and what the Jews were thinking because of all of those years, all those decades of all of this warfare, they're thinking those terms are deep-seated, deep-rooted.
Yeah.
And so when Peter thinks this, he's thinking of a Maccabean-style revolt.
Exactly.
Maccabees will come back in,
Mm-hmm.
and this time it's going to be God himself.
And how could you not think that way if you were a Jew? I mean, it's kind of like it's a part of your DNA. But that's the challenge of Christ to all people. What Hester was talking about was the intertestamental period with the Maccabees and the revolt. You know, Judas Maccabeus, very famous, and what they were able to do and actually reclaim the land of Israel for a period of time. And so there's always this possibility of coming out of bondage and coming out under those who would attempt to exercise control over them. That was always the hope, to be free, you know, and live as God's people. So, in this midsection, 3 times Jesus has to explain them, and 3 times the disciples are like, what? They argue over position. And Jesus goes, what are you talking about? You're arguing over what? And then he tells them, the Son of Man has to da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Same thing every time. You know, every time they're doing something that seems very important to them, but yet, in light of the ultimate goal of what Christ is, who he is, it's so, I mean, why are you down here talking about those things? So it's the redefinition of power and authority, which seems appropriate for the Gospel of Mark with the audience that he's addressing, and how he, by inspiration, is putting together the presentation and putting events together to illustrate this redefinition of power and what Messiah is. So, that to me is one aspect of why we have the suppression of the demonic world. If the demonic world is allowed to say, you're the Son of God, you have the power to destroy us, that's exactly what everybody is thinking in regard to who the Messiah is. He says, shut up and get out of here. Your definition is clouding and muddying, like everything else, the water. You're making it, you're affirming what people have in view of what I should do as Messiah. Everybody thinks they know who I should be, what I should do. Peter did. Lord, You are the Christ. This is what you should do. Not what you said. This is what you should do. Go ahead. Yeah, exactly. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting in Mark, he gets aggravated with his disciples. I don't know how many times, we'll see it later, but he goes, haven't you learned? Why don't you know? It's as if they're dull of hearing, as the Hebrew writer would say. And yet, it's in the death of Jesus that it all comes to understanding what he's doing. So how does that redefine then, if my Messiah has been redefined by the Messiah, how does that then impact me? How do I become a loyal and faithful disciple? That's one of the issues that Mark is addressing. Everybody has failed. Israel failed. The disciples failed. The only one who showed himself a true disciple is who? Jesus did, to his Father's will. Jesus shows himself to be the true disciple. He's faithful to the Father's will.
That sounds like something Peter would preach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is based on Peter's sermon.
Yeah.
It has that ring of
Yeah.
Peter
Yeah.
all the way through.
Okay, now, let's go to our lesson plan for today, which I doubt I'll finish, unfortunately. Now, this one may not take so long. I just want you to see something that happens in Mark. It happens in the gospel, but it happens mostly in Mark. Remember that in antiquity, in the relating of a narrative or a presentation or a story or whatever, the ancients had certain ways of doing things that we're not used to, because we have different ways of making emphasis. Like I've indicated before, today with our computer we can bold, italicize, put exclamation points everywhere we want, and put little quotations around a word to bring emphasis to it. All of those kinds of things. Well, they didn't have any of that. And being a more oral type of society, rhetoric is really a prized thing in antiquity. That's why the Greek philosophers, the cynics, and various street preachers and stuff, they always had audiences because people used to love to hear them speak. And so in order to maintain interest, in order to emphasize certain things, there are certain rhetorical techniques that are done that you see even in the writing by inspiration of our Scripture. God used these men to communicate His Word in human language, in their word selection, their technique, their organization, all these kinds of things. God was guiding the process. So even though I'm indicating structure and rhetorical things, I'm not shutting out inspiration. God's using all of this in the production, if you please, the writing of these Gospels, these books. Each of them are different. So God is drawing upon the personalities and the abilities of the writers themselves. They don't go beyond their abilities to communicate. You don't see that at all. God's using them. Okay? But He's also using the way that they were trained, how they learned in school, the way they would understand things and emphasize things. There's a technique that's done rhetorically that we've been able to identify. It's just called by various things, but one of the most simple things is almost like a bookend type. It's called bracketing, where you have, it's funny, you have a story, and all of a sudden in the middle of that story you break to another story, and then you come back to the outer story. And when you read, you start noticing this a lot, particularly in the book of Mark. And so the question is, well, what's Mark doing? What's the technique? He has a narrative, and then he breaks, and then there's something happens, and there's an inner type narrative that's complete on its own, and then there's a return to the outer story. So what's the deal? What's happening? Well, it's interesting that when you look at these and you look at the inner story and the outer story, what seems to be happening, and I think it is we find where the inner story actually sheds light or provides the meaning of the outer story. And in other words, there's a religious lesson there in how these narratives are bracketed with each other. Now, let's start with 20. Mark chapter 3 is one involving his family that you all are aware of. Now, understanding that this is Mark's gospel sheds some light as to the seriousness of what's happening here. And he came home, and the crowd gathered again to such an extent that they could not even eat a meal with his own people. When his own people heard of this, they went out to take custody of him, for they were saying what? He's crazy. He's insane. His own people were saying what? He's insane. Then drop down to verse 31. This is, if the inner story were taken out, it would continue. Okay. Then his mother and his brothers arrived, and standing outside, they sent word to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Behold," remember that word is an interjection of attention. "Behold, your mother and your brothers are outside for you." Answering them, he said, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" Looking about at those who were sitting around him. Now picture this, those who are sitting around him. Okay. He said, "Behold," the interjection, it's not "behold, your mother and other brothers are out there." It's "behold," what? "Look, these are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." That in itself is a great lesson, isn't it? So why the inner narrative? Is it just, because it's a part of the, the trajectory and the chronology of things? Well, let's look inside. There's going to be some thematic connections between the outer story and the inner story. So let's look at the inner story. 22. The scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying what? He is possessed by Beelzebub. Here's a connection to the outer story. His own people came and said, "Behold, he's out of his mind. He's crazy." There's a connection between the inner story and outer story. They're both what? What are they both doing in regard to Jesus? If his own people are saying he's crazy, and the religious people are saying he's crazy, that he's doing it by the power of Beelzebub, then, yeah. Well, they're standing against him for one thing. They're both the outsiders and those of his family and those of the religious leaders. They're standing against him. They don't think he's doing it by the power of Beelzebub. Well, that sounds very, very bad. But what if your own people come and see you and they say you're crazy? Is that not as bad? I mean, it's kind of like my brother always said things to me, But it's kind of shocking. You got a somewhat of a parallel here in the outer story, inner story. Let's continue reading. And he cast out the demons. He is possessed by Beelzebub, and he cast out the demons by the ruler of demons, they say. And he called them to himself, began speaking to them in parables, talking to the religious leaders. "How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, the kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, the house will not be able to stand. If Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is finished." How many times did you hear the word divided there? Several times. You think that's a main emphasis here? Continue reading. "But no one can enter the strong man's house and plunder his property unless he first binds the strong man." Who's the strong man? Jesus, the strong man. Come in, quote, Satan's world, binds him. He's able to do whatever he wants to. "And then he will plunder his house. Truly, I say unto you, all sins shall be forgiven the sons of men, and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin, because they were saying, he has an unclean spirit. So we focus on the idea, the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. Oh no, did I ever do that? Let me ask you this. Who in the outer story is close to blaspheming the Holy Spirit? His own. His own. What are they saying? What's the difference in what they're saying? Well, are they a little bit kinder? He's crazy. The religious over here, he's doing it by the power of Beelzebub. What's the worst sin? Yeah. Yeah. There's some serious problems going on here with people who have come to their own decision as to who this Christ is. His own say that he's insane. The religious rulers are saying that he has Beelzebub. They're both what? They're both wrong. His own don't get any mercy here, folks. His own, as long as they stay in this kind of position, what? You think they're going to get an out when those who say they blaspheme against the Holy Spirit never get an out? His own, the lesson is toward his own who are what? Doubting who he is. They're not listening to him. And if they stay in that situation, just like one who stays in the situation of denying the very power of God, there's no other system for salvation. If you reject Christ, you reject what? All of it. There's no forgiveness for that. Never will there be. If you stay, I don't care if you say, he's insane, or he's doing it by the power of Beelzebub. There's no other plan of redemption. There's no other Christ that's going to satisfy you. It's me. Jesus said in the inner story, I have entered the strong man's world, and I have bound him up and plundered his goods. He's insane. He's doing it by the power of Beelzebub. You see the parallel? Both camps are wrong, and they're in danger. Now, we go to the outer story again in the end. Hey, your mother and your brothers are out there, outside. And Jesus says what? Who are the ones that are not in danger? Those who are sitting, what? Around me. These are my mothers and brothers. That's very metaphoric, because in Judaism, the rabbi who was teaching his disciples would have his disciples what? Sit around him, and he would teach them. See, those who are Jesus are those who do his will. How are they pictured? Sitting around him. These are the ones who are my mothers and my fathers. Well, that's pretty harsh concerning your mother. Really? Mary? You were talking about Mary, right? Well, I know we have in Luke and all of that, Mary is held up, and you know, the women and stuff like that. This isn't what Mark is wanting the reader to know. He's showing that it doesn't matter if you're a part of my household, of my own, or you're the religious leaders. If you're not sitting around me and doing the will of God, you're in danger. That's pretty harsh. That's shocking. This is Mark, which he's very shocking, because the insider, or I should say insiders, are those who do the will of God. Those on the outside, he's crazy, he's doing it by the power of Beelzebub. Those are the real outsiders. Now, Mark isn't saying, okay, there's no hope for his family, there's no hope for these Jews and things like nature. He is stressing in how he puts this together of showing the danger of what people are thinking about the Messiah. They think They have it all defined and who the Messiah is and what he should do. Mark just destroyed that. It said, unless you are here obeying the will of my Father, that's those who are sitting around him in this context. These are my mothers and my brothers. Just because you're family doesn't mean you're an insider. Just because you're an Israelite doesn't mean you're an insider. Right? They're children of Abraham. That's right. That's just been put to bed. So Mark is very strong here. You know, when you read it, the parallels are just so dramatic. There's others that we'll look at that are very powerful in the lesson and the point that's being made. So my time's up, it looks like. But anyway, think about it and look through it. But Mark is very, how should I say it, very strong on what discipleship is. It has nothing to do with family, has nothing to do with blood relationship, has nothing to do with being a child of Abraham, Israelite, has everything to do with those who are sitting around him. These are my mothers, my brothers, those who obey the will of God. That's where you need to be. My family needs to be here, and those priests need to be here. You see? All right.